G'day legends, I hope that you are having a fantastic day and so far a fantastic week. Now, I am feeling way better than I was yesterday. For the last 3 or 4 days, I don't know what hit me, but I was very unwell. I was actually struggling to do bloody anything, but we are back. Well, I hope that we're back. But today we do have a lot to talk about. We're going to talk about F-16, some ins and outs, and also from Ukrainian pilots. We're going to have a really big look at the maps, defensive works, and maybe where Russia's next steps are in this map. We're going to look at some footage. We're going to talk about Ukraine joining NATO and what Zelensky has said. We'll also talk about conscription, and we will have a look at some footage of some strikes. Now, yesterday I said if anything comes out, I'll tell you, and we haven't seen anything come out. We got reports yesterday as I was putting up the video, as I was recording it, that ATACMS launched from Ukraine into Russia. We got reports of both Russian pages and Ukrainian pages of these launches for the second day in a row, and that air defense was active. Well, for 2 days in a row, it's seeming that these have been engaged. We haven't got any footage out of them being engaged or them hitting anything. And as I'll speak about in length in tomorrow's video, because it would just push this one way over the line, Russia is having a lot more success and effectiveness against GPS-guided weapons. And, you know, from what we're seeing, if the last 2 days, both sides are reporting the ATACMS are on the way out and no strikes, it's seeming to be true. Again, we have strikes being reported currently going on in Odessa from an attack this morning. I'll show you on the map. Of course, this is Ukraine and the capital of Kyiv. Odessa is the port city down here, one of, if not the most important region in this war, if Russia was able to get it, and for Ukraine to be able to maintain this for not only war strategy, but also for the economic reasons as well. Now, something we do need to look at is the footage that has come out from a strike on the 29th against Odessa of said to be an Iskander cluster munition. So this was either, some are reporting in the morning, some are reporting in the afternoon. More are saying in the afternoon. Down on this like esplanade here, we can see a cluster munition go off here. And cluster munitions are a horrible thing in general. And people saying this was directly targeting to produce mass civilian casualties. As we know, there has been a lot of civilian casualties in Odessa from Russian strikes. Now, of course, there's always going to be speculation of this was going towards a target, was hit by EW or by air defense, and has then gone off somewhere where it wasn't originally targeted. And vice versa, you'll always have the arguments on both sides. I've actually reached out to my lawyer friend. You've probably seen on this channel a bit, and I've just asked him, and I'll get an answer within a couple of days about, like, what does the law say if something is going towards a military target, it's engaged, and then it goes into a civilian area? What does the law actually say about this? So I just want to get an answer here. But again, cluster munitions in these areas is bloody terrible of this going off. Was it directly targeted or not? Again, I'll leave that up to you. Now, let's speak about NATO before we get into the maps, because I know once I do the maps, you guys are fucking out. We've spoken about Ukraine joining NATO and the EU and all of this for basically 2 years. Now, what we have been very strict on this channel is saying that there's no way, in our opinion, or my opinion, that Ukraine is going to join NATO without the war coming to an end. And Ukraine has said the war will continue until it clears its 91 borders. And what we know is, well, that means it will continue for years and years. And of course, joining NATO then gets pushed back and back and back, as well as, you know, you need the majority of countries in NATO. One can veto for another country to join, such as Ukraine, and that Ukraine does need to meet those minimum requirements to also join NATO. And I got this message, and I'm going to do a video all about the diplomacy of this war and what, like, foreign diplomats are looking at as far as where this goes. But I think you're very right to question long-term financial commitments to Ukraine. If Ukraine is to rebuild, and particularly rebuild its military, the war needs to end. For the war to end, a peace treaty needs to be signed. Now, regardless of where the border ends up, whether it's on the 1991 borders, including Crimea and Donetsk, or wherever that ends up, a peace treaty will have to be sign for just not a re-invasion at some point. Do you think the Russians will agree to any peace treaty that allows Ukraine to rebuild a modern, powerful NATO-style military? I really don't. So, of course, they're going to be stuck in this very hard spot, regardless of where this border falls and the joining of these rebuilding of military. And we've heard Russia talk a lot about the demilitarization of Ukraine as a goal in this. But I just want to know your ideas on where you think this will end and how it will end. But Zelensky has said this reported by European Pravda. Zelensky, NATO will only accept Ukraine as a member after victory, which, we know. But describing timeline for Ukraine's NATO membership, I believe we will only join NATO after our victory. I do not believe that NATO will accept us while the war is going on. For some NATO members, it's risky. And for some, there is simply skepticism because of it. Of course, it's risky. If Ukraine was to enter NATO now, Article 5 can and would be enacted by what NATO has lined out. And next thing, you've got a major war potentially a war between two major nuclear powers. Now, people say, you can't throw that around, but that would be where that ends up. I'm not saying that therefore those are going to be fired, but of course, this takes the war from localized to massive very, very quickly. The question of joining NATO, as the Secretary General has correctly stated, is a question of majority. And the majority is a political issue. In order for Ukraine to be politically accepted into the alliance, we need to win. So pointing out what we have said, that Ukraine would need to clear back to wherever it has stated those borders. As my friend has said, a peace treaty signed. And at the end of the day, whether it's the borders or not, Russia has to be involved somewhere, except if you have some black swan event and Russia completely collapses, which is looking less and less likely, actually, the longer the war goes on, with alliances being formed with other countries and how Russia's economy has been so stable against these sanctions. When it comes to Ukraine's membership of the alliance, Zelensky believes that no one will raise questions about the compatibility with NATO and the level of the Ukrainian military. That said, it will still require, at the end of this war, tens, hundreds of billions of dollars to raise a military, and we've heard numbers in the high hundreds, low trillions of money to actually rebuild Ukraine. So NATO membership, and many people saying, NATO now, it's just not, whether you like it or not, I just believe this is not going to happen anytime soon. And even when the war ends, it may take several years of diplomacy before we actually see any movements on that. I'm not being a prick, I'm just being realistic, which is basically my entire life. But let's actually have a look at the maps. Here we have Ukraine in the center, the capital of Kyiv. The red areas occupied since 2022 and the purple since 2014. The green areas, of course, where Russia has been at some point, has either been pushed out by Ukraine or has had a withdrawal. In some areas, bit of both. Now, where we want to look at is Donetsk Oblast, as this will be in the clickbaity thumbnail, clickbaity title, but we can see that this girthy boy has become more girthy, out expanding control near Selivov, out from Oshoretny, out from Kedemik as well. And like we spoke about yesterday, that this area in here was likely to close up, and that it has, of course, taking this part of this road that connects down to Pokrovsk, and this major road that led between Pokrovsk, Keramik, and Konstantinivka has now been taken in between these two. This is an important change on this map, and this is a large amount of ground. Estimations since October here, people have put it about 260, 270 square kilometers of ground, which that is a lot. So let's have a look at what maybe the next advancements here will be. Now, many people, including I, thought that it would be an eastern advance to try and push somewhere in the direction of Pokrovsk, where others are saying, no, it's going to be more of a northern advancement to try and cut off supply into New York and eventually into Chasiv Yar. So a movement in Chasiv Yar and a movement towards these areas, and this intersection here will have this area down here, which has held, as we can see, since 2014, will come under major limited supply to get these main routes. Now, before we have a look at where those are and what Suryak says about this, let's have a look at what Warmapper has spoken about with the defensive lines here, and look at the defensive lines and see what we can see. So Warmapper says this: in Donetsk, Ukrainian fortifications are more fragmented compared to the long connected lines seen in Zaporizhia. Defensive features like dragon's teeth and anti-vehicle ditches are largely absent, leaving the area more vulnerable to the current Russian offensive pressure. And I've said before, Warmapper is very, very conservative for Russian gains. I can't speak. But let's have a look at what he says. Connected lines in ZAP and compared to the lines in Donetsk. So, of course, here is Osheretny, here is Kedemik, showing on this map. See what I mean about much more conservative towards grey zone and gains. But you can have a look at the connected lines. Of course, these are the Russian ones. The connected lines, this is Robotny, Orokhiv, areas you'll be, familiar with. But you can see the lack of connection of some of these from his assessment. But you can also see that heading in the east, you're going to come up against a lot of these that are, of course, in, fighting off what is to be a Western offensive, well, an offensive coming from the west if you're there. But if they were able to push down to the south or north, you could bypass or take away the effectiveness of a lot of these defensive works. This is similar to what a lot was saying around in the south, that if Ukraine was able to push through somewhere like Robotny, that if they were able to spearhead down in here to then clear east or west, takes away the effectiveness of where these trench systems and these defensive works are actually built up. Now, I'll show you the second part of this one on the right. So he has drawn some of the lines of these mutually beneficial to each other. Now, this is the main one we're going to be familiar with out from Osheretny and Kedemik out here as well. But we do know that these are being built up over the last few months, and many have pointed that this should have been done a long, long time ago. So we're going to be pretty wordy in this part. Before then, we have a look at some other interesting changes on the map, including one that Syriac had a couple of days prior of a Ukrainian gain up in the north. But as of curiosity, the Russian spearheads is located 24 kilometers from the 2014 line in Avdiivka, so back down here, and only 26 kilometers from Pokrovsk. However, this is not the Russian priority target for now, like we just spoke about before. The breach of the Ukrainian defences in Osheretny has produced a situation of confusion in the Ukrainian command, which is unable to stop the Russian advance. The capture of Osheretny is very reminiscent of the capture of Popasna, which allowed the Russian army in 2022 to advance towards Bakhmut, Soledar, and the bastions of Lysychansk and Severodonetsk. What is expected after the capture of this new bastion by Russian forces? Around Osheretny, there is a high area that runs along the railway and extends towards the north. Taking this and the latest advances in the area into account, we can predict the Russian advances would develop as follows. And as we can see, this push northwards. Let's have a look at this high ground. This is Osheretny, Kedemik here. I know I've lost the things. We can see this high ground out from Osheretny and high ground out then to the north of where Russia is moving currently. Again, this isn't mountainous, this is sort of up and down, but still in the flat ground, any high ground is still incredibly important. Now, stick with me. We're going to have a bit of bloody wordy, bit of willy speaking, and we'll zoom in on this map to get an idea, and I'll go between the maps too. Part one, the Russian army will continue advancing westwards towards Prohez. So if we have a look on this map, Prohez sitting down here. Ooh, sorry. So part one here. The capture of this town will allow fire control to be established on the Ukrainian troops located east of Kharkivsky Reservoir, which will hinder Ukrainian logistics in this area, which will withdraw as the Russians continue to advance along that axis. Simultaneously, Russian troops will advance along two major axes. So we're still looking at number one here, out towards Prohez and onto these reservoirs out as well, pushing back and back. First of them will target the road junction located at Highway H32, which connects Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka. This will be a serious blow to the arrival of reinforcements and supplies to the second city, as Pokrovsk is the epicenter of the Donbass, leaving only the road to Kramatorsk as the main logistical route. Where are we talking about? We are talking about this part just here. Of course, talking Pokrovsk, and we already know this main route that comes down to Pokrovsk in here has been cut. This road is very good. This one to push out to Prohez, and then a push out to here, which would then cut this road and its ability to then, let's get rid of these, to come all the way up into Konstantinivka, as well as then into Kramatorsk. And that limits the supply in here, as this road here is already limited by fire control in areas. The second of the advances will be towards the north, targeting the town of Kalinovi. It is expected that these advances will allow the reopening of Highway 20 access, taking the towns of Australian and this one here. So let's have a look at where this is. Kalinovi, and taking these towns in Australian and whatever other towns in this sort of New York direction in here, as we can see from number 3 and 4 then shown on this map. Now, let me bring up part 2. Part 2. After Kalinovi, a Russian advance will continue northwards, reaching the town of Zoria. The natural barrier of this Black Reservoir will prevent Russian troops from advancing further due to the danger that Ukrainian army could easily bombard them from Konstantinivka. So what we're talking about is we look at Konstantinivka and this major reservoir sitting in here, shown on this map. Konstantinivka reservoir here, bombardment from there. The situation must be unblocked by advancing along the H32 highway, located in the high area at the same time that the Russian forces consolidate and expand control over the highway crossing. So this crossing up here, which would bypass said reservoir. This advance will possibly be the most complex given the extensive defences that the Ukrainian command has been preparing there for months, since the capture would mean reaching the southwestern outskirts of Konstantinivka. So if able to get through those areas, you're going to be up in Konstantinivka, which your next step then is into areas such as Bakhmut and closing off this frontline area here, which has held for the entirety of the war and in parts then 10 years or more than now. So this is then part 3, speaking about this the wanted next steps into Konstantinivka. This is the reservoir here. This is Oshoretne. This is Keramik, to give you an idea. These advances would leave the Ukrainian agglomerations of Toretsk, New York, and this, so those areas down in here we're speaking about, in a kind of semi-encirclement in which only one supply route would remain. The capture of Chasiv Yar in Bakhmut in the following months by the Russian army would leave the Ukrainian troops in a critical situation. At a time when Russian troops would surely begin to attack New York, pushing them from the defense lines of 2014. So push on New York, this of course being Chasiv Yar up here, and then that major envelopment of these areas. This analysis is a long-term prediction, which will take the rest of the spring and part of the summer. Furthermore, it does not take into account the development that may exist on other fronts, so the magnitude of Russian advances is difficult to calculate. So if Ukraine start pushing somewhere else, then troops will have to be moved, or if Russia want to launch their north group, of course, things are going to change. However, you can't predict the future. However, it will not have the same relative ease as capturing Oshoretne. The Ukrainian army is sending many reinforcements to this area to stop the Russian advances that will eventually slow down. In addition to the Ukrainian defences built, possibly we're talking about a Russian offensive horizon this year, after which there will be a return to the Russian defensive posture in order to recover from wear and tear. Being on the advancement, you have large losses and, of course, a lot of equipment being not only used and destroyed, but just heavy bloody wear and tear. So Russia will have to sit back in defensive for an amount of time. On the other hand, the arrival of American aid would give a new boost to the Ukrainian army to prepare counteroffensive on several fronts and recover as much as possible from the losses suffered in recent months. So that we know that American money is going to start flowing in this week, next week, and we will see how that will affect it. But of course, it's going to have an effect to some degree and could slow down this or change how it's going. Again, you can't predict the future. However, the situation of its forces is worsening. It's meeting Ukraine day after day, especially due to troop problems that it is suffering, and the new mobilizations will have to solve if the Ukrainian government really wants to continue the conflict for several more years in optimal conditions. Now, I've said this before, that no country is showing that it will have a victory within years or years. The Ukrainian offensive last year, what was built up more than an offensive this year with new armies raised, all this new equipment, whatever, for capturing, maybe 10 kilometers in some areas. Same with Russia. This war could continue for several years. We know Ukraine is getting money from the US. the thing that the US, what France, the EU can't fix is they cannot fix manpower issues if they're not prepared to deploy soldiers. And personally, I don't think that NATO is willing to deploy soldiers. NATO, at the end of the day, is US. US will never leave NATO, because if they leave NATO, they don't have any reach or influence in Eurasia. At the same time, that NATO will never go against America because they need its nuclear sort of umbrella as well. So again, we can't predict the future, but this is what Syriac, and I agree with this, assesses the Russian senior command's overall picture is here. But let's actually just compare these two maps. You're probably only looking for this, but we can see maybe a little bit more out in the north here, but again, very, very close. I actually believe shows maybe less of a capture through here than the MOD map, but situation north of Avdiivka, Russian army advance west and south of Solivov, as shown here, towards Sokil and Novopolsk, respectively. In addition, troops continue to advance northwest of Oshoretny, taking control over new plantations adjacent to the eastern outskirts of this. Moreover, Russian forces take full control over Keramik following Ukrainian army withdrawal towards here and increase the pressure over the central trench system, which is almost surrounded. So push out back to here for Ukraine as well. Ukraine moving back into these other areas. And the idea that the ground lines of communication were going to be cut in here as this becomes more and more girthy, I think is less and less likely. As this pushes, it means air defense and systems have to move back, and we're going to see more and more of these fabs being dropped in areas like this. Yes, I talk about fabs a lot, as I believe it's one of the weapons having the most effect anywhere on the front line. Now, let's have a look let's actually have a look at a Ukrainian gain, come up into the northeast here. Now, we won't talk that far up yet, but in Terni, we then see this become green in here as there is a Ukrainian gain in here. Now, Syriac map actually showed this about 3 days ago. He showed this advancement in here, so faster than their own map, but then he has another update here showing more territory, wrong one, more territory for what he said last time as well, in very similar, same area. Situation north of Donetsk. During the last 2 days, Ukraine army continued its momentum and recaptured new positions east of Yamplivka. So as we know, when you push somewhere, they'll push somewhere else, like a Chinese finger trap bloody thing. Now, let's come up into Kislivka, as we haven't seen any change on this map up in here. So we have Kislivka down here. We did see Russia advancing through here. No change on this today, but Syriac says this. Situation northeastern front. During the last 2 days, Russian army made small advances to the west of Kislivka and south of the locality in the direction of this. So trying to capture this next town down in here, as well as the rest of Kislivka, and close up this gap here. The ultimate goal in this northeastern front being Kupiansk. Still, we hear more and more from Ukraine about the danger of this area and a major Russian advance of the North group here. Again, we just don't know. Now we'll come back down into Bakhmut, or Avdiivka 1.0. Now, let's have a look here. We see, let's come down, Ivanovsky here, this push out that is happening on these areas. That we spoke yesterday that on this micro-district out here of Chasiv Yar that Russia wasn't able to consolidate and got pushed out. Situated east of Chasiv Yar, Russian army made new advances south Mount Baba and reached the water channel in this axis for the first time. Meanwhile, clashes with the Ukrainian army are taking place at the last point of this mount. So in here, of course, the high ground, but built up into Chasiv Yar. We know Russia would really like to gain that area. Now, we have one more big change in this map. Now, Krasnohivka completely just ignored by this map, which I think is disappointing for the credibility of this map. As we know, there is footage of Russian vehicles coming down here, dropping troops off into here and into here. We know that. It's geolocated footage. It's released by Ukrainian pages as well. So anyway, then we come down to Uruzani front, which we had updates on, but there is a, I'll say, semi-large chunk of ground. We're speaking 1 kilometer, which in the days of this war is a hell of a lot. You know, every meter is fought for. A Russian advancement towards Uruzani, closing up area that Ukraine got in their counter offensive. So don't have a Surak update today, but he did have one the other day. Now, Robotnik here, this is so hard to know what's going on because some maps say that this is more like this and that there's not really many troops actually present here. Again, we don't know, but what I do have for you is a photograph from a drone just showing the absolute destruction of Robotnik here. And again, in such flat areas like this where everything is just flattened, that there may not be much troop presence like we saw in Mariinka just due to there being bloody zero cover. But again, we will continue and see where these maps change. We don't have any updates down in the Kherson Oblast with the island as well. I'm still waiting to see some geolocated footage of this. Now, something I want to speak about before we then speak about the F-16s is what would you guys think if the F-16s were based, in somewhere like Poland, Romania, Slovakia, Hungary, the F-16s were based there. They fly into Ukraine unarmed, land at an airfield, fuel, armament, and then go onto the front line. Do you think NATO would be willing to go for that? We know the biggest threat to these F-16s, one, it's going to be in the air from bloody S-400, but secondly, is going to be where the hell do you store them? It's going to be very obvious, building bunkers, building runways for these planes. We've seen the majority of Ukrainian planes recently that have been destroyed on the ground by Russian Iskanders or Tornadoes. Could they sit in NATO unarmed, fly in, arm and fuel, touch and go, and then continue on? I don't know. But what do you think of that? Do you think that could be something that Ukraine is looking to do with NATO and these systems? Now, we have a video here of F-16s in the Netherlands with with Ukrainian pilots.
It is really a super fun jet to fly. I'm not saying that MiG that I flew before is super boring, but
speaking about, the F-16 compared to a MiG-29.
The F-16 is definitely more agile. It easily moves. The moment you think of something,
Denmark, sorry.
Turns. I felt proud, not only for myself, but only for the rest of the guys, and that we are doing it now. I know how much work has been done to have this opportunity.
That would be a big thing, to go from flying MiGs in Ukraine, an ex-Soviet country, to now going into the EU, NATO, to fly bloody F-16s.
It has been updated several times.
So we didn't exactly know we know these aircraft get updated here and there, and saying that these are an updated version that is competitive against the best Western fighters.
Here it's a very, very modern aircraft. It's competitive with the best Western fighters, and I'm sure that the Ukrainian Air Force will benefit from that.
The biggest boost here is the motivation to go back and keep fighting with new jets.
We are in this together, and we have a lot
it's going to be incredibly
people.
Interesting to see the effect that these have. The country that probably knows best about how the targeting of these will go down, and I'm guessing not willing to share, is Turkey, as Turkey has S-400 systems and F-16s, and to my knowledge, which could be incorrect, has actually tested, not live of course, but S-400 radars against these specific aircraft. So I guess we will see, but again, I think so much hangs on the balance of these and the way that they were built up, way more so than the Leopards, Abrams, Charlies as well. Now, we need to talk about conscription, as we spoke about manpower issues in Ukraine and the fixing of this. Now, this has come out from the Deputy Prime Minister for European and Euro-Atlantic Integration of Ukraine, Olga, that Ukraine will not forcibly return men of conscription age from abroad. So won't be going abroad, grabbing guys off the street like's happening in Kiev, and out you go. Therefore, there will be no restrictions for forced return of Ukrainian citizens of any gender or age to a warring country. But there will be no pleasant solutions to war issues. And let's not forget that the war is ongoing and we must win it. So any age or gender, no forced return. But what we do know is that there is some level of forced return with taking away abilities for institutions for diplomatic reasons. Saying here as well, Ukraine has adopted new law on mobilization, and we need to understand to what extent we can replace guys at the front. It is about the potential of mobilization, accounting, and information. And this is the primary goal of our decision. And as they point out here, that suspend the provision of services for Ukrainian diplomatic institutions to men, and the law of mobilisation. The next day, the government of Ukraine published rules according to passports for men of conscription age can be issued only within Ukraine. So trying to get guys back on to the front line, of course, because we know there is a manpower shortage, difficult to fix, and we have some people who could fix the issue, or the NATO account saying, why wouldn't they go back and fight? Well, if there, you could go and actually help fix the issue, as well as we have on TikTok some Ukrainian men being like, I'm not going back. And I look on the comments and stuff of this, like, I wish I could give up my citizenship. I'm not willing to do that. Germany has said that they may issue, in some cases, like temporary residency. Poland has said they will help Ukraine but won't like forcibly evict people. So it will be interesting to see where this goes and how these manpower issues are fronted. I think this is the biggest issue facing Ukraine, much more than weapons and funding and support from the West, which we know is going through. We know might be rocky at some points, but a manpower problem, very, very difficult. Could there be ways to attract Western soldiers to Ukraine, like post-Western soldiers like the Foreign Legions? Potentially. We know there's a lot less going now due to other issues. I don't know. We will see, I guess. Anyway, legends, I hope that you're having a fantastic day. I hope you're looking after yourself. I hope this one went a little better. I'm feeling much, much bloody better. Look after yourselves. If you'd like to support me, links down below. If you want to join the PMC, links also down below. Look after yourself. I'll speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.